and chat will be archived unedited on RS's Facebook page. If you do not wish to be recorded, you could just mute your microphone, turn off your own video, and refrain from participating in the chat. You will still be able to see and hear the class. We will now start the recording. So welcome everyone. We're so glad to see you and we hope you're all doing well. I'm Paula Fuchsberg. Thank you so much for joining my fellow speaker, Julia Williams, and me, along with our tech angel, Candace Nemoff, for this New Days of Learning class titled Suffragists, Our Jews in the News, for which we have 1 hour allotted. Let's begin with a prayer for studying Torah, which will be shared on the screen. Sorry, I can't see if that's up yet. Ah, there we go. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. One second. We will now move ahead to our topic, which we're excited to share with you. Both Julie and I are involved in the RS Suffrage Project, which has focused on bringing to light and honoring the lives and activities of Jewish suffragists in Philadelphia as our way of commemorating this year's centennial of American women gaining the right to vote. Julie and I will focus on the stories of two inspiring Philadelphia Jewish suffragists whom we've recently written about for the bulletin. And we'll take you behind the scenes of how we uncovered details about their lives, their motivations, and their contributions to the suffrage movement. You may not come across their names in the history books, but traces of their activism can be found in the public record. And they serve as a reminder that it's often those who champion a cause with conviction and passion, yet do so in near anonymity, who help bring about positive change in the world. So Julie will start us off and tell us about the suffragist Bertha Sapowitz, and then I'll talk about Jenny Rance Dornblum. After that, we'll be happy to answer questions, so please hold any you may have until then. Thank you, and take it away, Julie. Oh, can't hear.
I'm unmuted now. Okay. In the fall of 2019, I went to a meeting at the synagogue of something called the RS Suffrage Project. I was aware it was the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, and I was curious to see what the project was about. Because the project was in its formative stage, people spoke about their interests and their ideas. Does my sound okay? Is it all right?
It's got feedback, Julie.
And is there something you can do about that? Any ideas?
You have a phone on here, you can turn it off.
Oh, I do have a phone. I was going to time myself so I didn't go into overtime. Okay.
No, the phone is only a problem if you have it also hooked up to Zoom.
No, I don't.
Okay, well then you're fine using your phone.
Okay, well, let's see what happens. Because the project was in its formative stages, people came with some ideas and went away to look into, follow up on those ideas, and then we would come back and talk about what we found. Our hope was to put together a project that could be presented to the congregation in 2020, and we're well on schedule to present a number of programs. I had previously done some research about and reading about suffragists in the United States, and I had a picture in my mind of what they were like. And partly it was formed by this reading. Probably some of it came from watching the Disney movie, Mary Poppins, where there's a suffragist mother. And I thought they must be white upper middle class women. And when I went to the meeting at RS, I was pretty certain, or I thought we wouldn't find a lot. And I'm really happy to say that I was wrong. In fact, I found lots of evidence of Jewish women who are activists, but also lots of men and women of all races and religions in Philadelphia who are active for the cause. So could I have the first image, please? I started doing my research by doing some quick reading of secondary sources. Candace, did you find mine? There we go. This is the wrong set of images. These are Paula's. The Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia has a lengthy entry on the women's suffrage movement by Tamara Gaskill. And Gaskill's article led me to a book by Caroline Katzenstein called Lifting the Curtain, the State and National Women's Suffrage Campaign. Do we have a slide? Candace? Okay. Wait for a second. The first one, please. There we go. Okay, so Caroline Katzenstein, the woman on the left of my screen, was a young woman, a young Jewish woman who was a paid employee of one of the suffrage organizations in Philadelphia. In the 1950s, as you can probably guess, the date from the cover of this book is really 50-ish. She wrote a history about the state and national suffrage campaign in Pennsylvania. And it's let's see, it's a kind of dry story, the way she tells it, but I was able to find some names in it of people who sounded Jewish. And so I thought I would follow them and see what else I could find out. And the names that just for a couple of examples, Bertha Sapowitz, Olga Gross, Anna Lowenberg, and there were others. So for any of you who've ever done any kind of historical research, you probably know the process. You first go to the secondary sources like Katzenstein's book and the articles in the Jewish Encyclopedia or the Philadelphia Encyclopedia. And then you move on to primary sources like government documents, photos, newspaper articles, and if you're really lucky, you find letters and diaries. And I started my research for primary sources at the Pennsylvania Historical Society. I said it backwards, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, where Caroline Katzenstein's papers are housed. So ever an optimist, I was hoping to find some sort of diary or maybe letters from her work while she was a suffrage activist. Could I have the next slide? Unfortunately, most of the files were mainly material that was covered in her book. In fact, in my mind, I think that the files there may have been the materials she used to write the book. But there were some interesting things, and like this little stamp, which she designed and the suffragists sold as a way to raise funds. And you can see on the stamp that part of the country already had women's suffrage. And it was the eastern part of the country that the suffragists had to work on, because in the West, the women already had the vote. So, can I have the next slide? Now, this doesn't look very exciting to anybody else, but to me, this was the real find of the day when I was at the Historical Society. This is a list on women's suffrage headquarters letterhead of women who went to Harrisburg in 1911 to lobby for the vote. And the reason it's exciting to me is that there are a lot of names on it. And not only are there names, could we have the next slide? There are addresses. So, and you can see these names. Whoops, we went one too far. Thank you. So if you look at these names, they have addresses with them, and that's very exciting because with addresses, you can verify information that you find in the census. And so this gave me a lot more information about some of these women. So with these names, I started to look to see what I could find out about them. And currently, there are many online resources available. Unfortunately, many of them are by subscription only. In any case, newspapers.com has digitized our local papers back at this time and has a very user-friendly search function. Could I have the next slide? So off I went searching the names that I found. And I understand that this is not a very clear image because it's from a digitized version of the newspaper that's been blown up. And so just bear with me. It's kind of the best you can do, or the best I could do. So off I went searching for the names, and I found this image, which I love. And this image really was the inspiration that I needed, because what it shows, if you look really closely, is two young Jewish women, confident and comfortably standing with this group of working men where they had just been there urging them to vote for women's rights. And I started to wonder, who are these people, these women? And that was the direction I needed for my research. And I've written about one of these women in the bulletin, and that's the woman who's on the left, the taller of the two. That's Olga Gross. And then the short little woman is Bertha Sapowitz. Can I have the next slide? All right. So this is a cartoon that appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer around this time. And I just put it in because it's funny, but it also shows that suffrage was an issue that was well known by the populace, and so well known that it was even showing up in popular culture like cartoons. And basically this poor guy has a wife who goes out every night to work for suffrage, and he's so tired of not being able to go out, he finally takes a dressmaker's dummy out with him. I don't know how funny it is, but I thought it was an interesting cartoon. In 1915, when this was around the time this was made, the pro-woman suffrage organizations in Philadelphia were focused on a single goal, and that was passing an amendment in Harrisburg to allow women to vote. Barred from the voting booth, women had to convince the male voters of Pennsylvania to support them. These suffragists organized a campaign of persuasion. They tried letter writing, chalking sidewalks, giving lectures, and street speaking, displaying posters and marching in parades. Could I have the next one, Candace? Thank you so much. This is Bertha Sapowitz, who I'm going to be talking about. Street corner oratory, especially if the speaker was a woman, attracted a lot of attention. Philadelphia newspapers announced where women were to be speaking during the day and in the evening. They also would print reports of what the women said at these speeches. And one of the most prolific speakers in Philadelphia was this woman, Bertha Sapowitz. Bertha was an American-born daughter of immigrant parents. Her parents were Jews who emigrated from Europe in the 1870s. Could I have the next slide? This is a census from 1910, and we can learn a lot about the family from it. Could I have the detail? Thank you. So this is the Sapowitz family. And at the top is the father, who's listed on, I'm pointing, and you can't see what I'm pointing at, sorry. At the top you see Louis, who is the head of the family. He was born in Russia, and he worked as a jeweler. He owned his own store, And he also owned his own house, which you can also see from one of the columns on the census form. His wife, Jenny, is there, and there's 7 children who were living at home. The younger 3 children were all in school, and the older 4 all worked. And I'm going to tell you what the oldest daughter did, just because it's so interesting. She was a pianist at a moving picture show. And then Bertha is the next daughter listed, and she was a sales clerk in a department store. So could we go to the next slide? This is just a sampling of articles from the local paper. And newspapers such as the Delaware County Daily News in Chester, Pennsylvania, covered local news thoroughly. And we know a lot about Bertha's life because of it. She had appendicitis, she got bitten by a dog, she visited people in Philadelphia in 1911, and that was worthy of a newspaper article. She was present at her father's store during a robbery and a subsequent shootout, and she testified in court about that. In 1916, her father's obituary in the paper described Bertha as one of the leaders in women's suffrage circles in Philadelphia. So by 1915-16, she had left Chester and was living in Philadelphia. She had a grandmother in Philadelphia, and that's probably who she was living with. Could I have the next slide? This is an article from the Exponent, the Jewish Exponent, and it's from 1915. And you can see it's from the women's page because there's a baking powder. See, I'm pointing again. There's a baking powder ad at the top of the page. So it was from the women's page. So the Jewish Exponent reported that she made her first open air speech in April 1915. Soon after, she was engaged by the Equal Franchise Society, which is just one of many suffrage organizations in the city. And she was hired to spend a month talking to working people and convincing them to vote for suffrage. The Caroline Katzenstein, I have to read this part out loud, wrote about her in her book. And she said, one of the workers at Gimbel Brothers, Bertha Sapowitz, became an enthusiastic suffragist and volunteered to speak at our open air meetings in the middle of the day. She had a remarkable voice that could rise above the noise on busy 9th Street, and she loved to be heckled by the crowd. Her good humor and quick wit won us many friends. I don't think you can read it, so I'll tell you that the Exponent described her this way. She is a Jewess, she speaks Yiddish, and is particularly effective in appealing to the working man. Her meetings attract large crowds, and she is making many converts. Okay, the next slide. Thank you. Again, this is a copy from a newspaper. It's not a great image. Not great quality image. It's a great image though. In May of 1915, the suffragists put on a huge parade in Philadelphia. More than 10,000 people marched in what the local paper called the opening of the campaign for women's suffrage, a campaign that will be waged with vigor and enthusiasm until its purpose has been accomplished. The parade was followed by open air meetings in locations like Washington Square, City Hall Plaza, the Metropolitan Opera House. And Bertha spoke at least 3 different locations that day. So with the goal of winning the vote in Pennsylvania in 1915, November 1915, these women took off, and Bertha became an active member of what was called the Suffrage Army. She spoke around the region in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, before being assigned to organize the whole state of Delaware. It's hard to measure concretely her success, but the Trenton, New Jersey paper said she got 47 men to pledge to vote for suffrage when she spoke at the Fells Naphtha factory in Trenton. A personal convert was her brother Harry, who was a student at Central High School, and he wrote an essay for the Evening Public Ledger in 1915, detailing his reasons for supporting women's suffrage, and the paper published his photograph and this headline: Central High School lad follows his sister, Miss Bertha Sapowitz, leader of the fight for the ballot. Despite efforts like these, the fall of the election in 1915 failed to win the vote for women, and the suffragists of Philadelphia, who must have been disappointed, did not cease the fight. They continued to campaign in states with upcoming elections. Could I have the next slide? Okay, thank you. Bertha went on a tour, speaking in many cities before settling in Davenport, Iowa, where she was in charge of organizing for an equal suffrage group. In 1916, when you start looking at newspapers in 1916 for her name, you find her name in dozens of newspapers across the Midwest. She spoke in Iowa, Illinois, in Indiana, and she spoke to audiences large and small. I found she spoke to a group of postal workers, she spoke to a lot of women's clubs, and she spoke to church groups. It's kind of interesting too, she's not always identified as being from Philadelphia. Sometimes they say she's from New York, which I think might be shorthand to say that she's Jewish, but maybe not, I don't know. So by the end of 1916, Sapowitz was back in her home region. She was first organizing in Delaware, and then she came back to Philadelphia. She embraced the tactics of the suffragists in the Women's Congressional Union and later the National Women's Party. And this was a change in tactics in the suffrage movement to focus on winning the right to vote in the federal system rather than state by state. And these women decided that one of the things they would do was they would pressure President Wilson to come out in favor of women's voting. Could I have the next slide? Okay, another not great slide, but a wonderful image. This is Bertha at the end, the short one, and she's with a group of women who are picketing at the White House, and they're in their rain gear because it was a rainy day. And what I found pretty interesting about this picture is it was published in Philadelphia, but it was also published around the country. I think this particular one is from Oregon. So they tried this new method of protest by standing in front of the White House, putting pressure on the president, and continued the other things that they had been previously doing. So finally, in 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment. Then the states had to ratify it. Pennsylvania did it quickly, but other states did not. It took a full year before the final state ratified it and it was added to the Constitution. Could I have the next slide? It's another census slide. There you go. Like many of the women who devoted so much of their youth to secure the voting rights for women, Bertha mostly disappears from public life. In 1920, she was living in Chicago with her new husband, whose name was Samuel Michael Nunez Cardoso. The couple had married in June 1919, just a few weeks after Congress passed the 19th Amendment. I don't know how they met, but I like to imagine maybe he saw her speak at one of these Midwestern stops and he was converted politically and romantically, and they married. I don't know. They were childless and they lived in Kokomo, Indiana, where they ran a gas station and a grocery store. Bertha seems not to have used her oratorical gifts after the fight for suffrage, with the exception of being a good speaker at the local business women's club. She was active in the 1930s briefly for the Democratic Party, and she even ran for a local office, which she lost. She died in February 1984 at the age of 91. And while I found a death certificate for her, nowhere did I find an obituary which might have recounted at least some of the accomplishments of this woman who worked so hard to secure women the right to vote. But I have the next image. Thank you. And I know this is really blurry, but I have a reason for it. This blurry enlargement is a visual metaphor for the frustration I feel as a researcher. I've been able to piece together the basic facts of Bertha's life, yet I can find nothing that tells me anything of her inner life, how she felt or what she thought. And that part of Bertha, I think, is lost. Because there's no letters, there's, as far as I could find, no living relatives. And so what she did will always remain just out of focus, and that makes me sorry. But still, what we can do here is acknowledge her work and thank her for the role she played in securing our right to vote. And Paula is going to speak now about another Jewish suffragist from Philadelphia.
Okay. Thanks, Julie. Now I'd like to share the story behind the story of Jenny Rance Dornblum, whom I wrote about for the just released May issue of the Bulletin. Can we show my first slide, please? Wait a here we go. So this is a photo of Jenny at about age 35, and I'll explain more about this photo shortly. But first, some background about Jenny. She was born here in 1889 to recent Russian Jewish immigrants. She had older siblings, but she was the first family member born in the US. When Jenny was just 5.5, her father died, and her mother Frida had to take in dressmaking work to support the family. Jenny later described watching her mother work herself to exhaustion, and this was probably a key motivator of Jenny's ultimately lifelong social activism. Beyond her involvement as a young adult advocating in Philadelphia for suffrage, she married a labor activist whom she met while working for the Shirtwaist Makers Union. She ran for Congress in 1924 at a time when it was 99% male. And she became a tireless proponent of world federalism and other causes throughout her very long life. She worked until age 96 and lived to be 102, so quite a life. So how did we learn about Jenny? Well, when our suffrage project began, one key question was what role, if any, RS and/or individual members of RS played in the suffrage movement. And several project members, including Julie, put considerable time and effort into archival research looking for answers to that question. They found, as you can see, plenty of compelling stories about local Jewish suffragists, but not specifically connections to RS. But given that we have congregants whose RS ties go back generations, we decided to put a notice in the January bulletin soliciting any family stories that might have been handed down from the suffrage era. So that notice ran, and in poured one email. But what a fascinating story grew out of that one response. So the email came from Liz Shapiro, a third-generation RS member and a grandniece of Jenny Rance Dornblum. And Liz wrote that she had a copy of a memoir Jenny typed up late in life that mentions her involvement in suffrage. So learning of this first-person account was like striking gold. I called Liz, and we eventually had several phone and email conversations. And I learned that given Jenny's longevity, she lived until 1991, Liz has some direct personal memories of her. She especially recalls Jenny's warmth and kindness. By the way, Liz had acquired Jenny's memoir a few years ago while cleaning out her mother's home, but at the time we initially connected, she hadn't yet read the whole thing. So after we first spoke, Liz set out to read the memoir in full, She also reached out through a family email list to older cousins who she hoped would have more detailed memories of Jenny. These even included some cousins Liz had never met. From that point forward, the research proceeded in two ways. Liz was reading the memoir and pursuing answers from her cousins, and I basically started Googling Jenny. I don't happen to subscribe to any genealogical or archival sites, fascinating as I find them, so I was just using ordinary public searches, and yet I was amazed, just searching that way, how many details turned up about Jenny. I did later realize that using just my free library card, I could readily browse through more extensive databases, including old census records. So I found the 1910 census page that shows the Rance household. And let's show the next slide, which is of that census page. No, that's further back. There we go. And I've highlighted the Rance family section and Jenny's name. So at the time of this census taker's visit, Jenny is 20 and doing secretarial work. Her widowed mother, Frida, is head of the household. The oldest daughter, Rose, is not listed. She may well have been married by then. So just below Frida is her second daughter, Elizabeth. That's Liz Shapiro's namesake grandmother. Elizabeth is followed by Jenny, and then their kid brother, Louis. And there had also been another brother who had died earlier. So with that introduction to the family, let's look at the next slide, which is an early 20th century family photo, courtesy of Liz. It's not dated, but it's clearly taken several years prior to 1910. Jenny is at the upper left and looks to be in her early and mid-teens. And clockwise from upper right are Elizabeth, Rose, and Louis, all surrounding their mother. Just a couple of interesting asides. Louis grew up to be quite a figure in his own right. He became a Hollywood producer, and he lived to be 101. But his story will have to wait for another time. Also, their census record provided a detail that Liz said her family hadn't previously known, that her grandmother, Elizabeth, was born in Russia. She would have been a toddler at the time the family emigrated. So as I noted earlier, the census record showed Jenny as a secretary at age 20. She had had to interrupt her high school education and study at night in order to work and help bring in family income. As she grew into young adulthood, she took courses at Drexel, Temple, and Penn, and she also took special interest in trying to understand issues affecting working class people, and particularly women. On the suffrage front, she writes in her memoir that she was a zealot for the cause. She begins to show up in the public record early in the final decade before women won the vote. I found newspaper items starting from 1911 or 12 that list her as a speaker at some of those open-air suffrage rallies that were held at street corners around the city. And these included rallies where Jenny spoke right alongside Alice Paul, one of the nation's most prominent suffrage leaders. Now, the news items that I found were behind a paywall, but you could access optical character recognition transcriptions, which were just barely legible enough to make out. Julie was later kind enough to send me an image from her newspapers.com subscription of a 1915 item from the Evening Public Ledger that also mentions Jenny. And let's show the next slide, which shows that suffrage events today item. So I've highlighted where this names Jenny, who by then was married to Isaac Dornbloom, as the speaker at a rally at Broad and Wallace Streets, as it happens just up the block from RS. Note, by the way, that coincidentally, Bertha Sapowitz appears elsewhere in this same clipping. I also found online the text of the 1955 memoir that Julie mentioned earlier by the Philadelphia Jewish suffragist leader Caroline Katzenstein, whom Jenny also worked alongside at some rallies. In her book, Caroline praises Jenny by name as an ardent suffragist and an able and very intelligent speaker. Now, when Liz first emailed us, she wrote that Jenny had run for Congress even before women won the vote. But thanks to all the historical material we now have at our fingertips, we can both verify and, where necessary, rectify the details that get handed down from past generations. So we found that Jenny had run for Congress 4 years after the 19th Amendment was adopted. So let's show the next slide, which is an encore showing of the photo of Jenny we saw earlier. This photo dates from her 1924 campaign. The photo is stamped property of the National Woman's Party. That was the suffrage organization that Alice Paul led, and it actually still exists today as an advocacy group for equal rights. In 1924, Jenny was one of 5 female congressional candidates from Pennsylvania whom the Woman's Party promoted in its Women for Congress initiative. Let's show the next slide, which shows a Woman's Party publication called Equal Rights, and this issue promoted all 5 Pennsylvania women. Overall, this was a weekly publication of the party, and this issue was dated the weekend right before the November 24 election. We see Jenny's photo is the top one among the 5 female candidates. And among the text below, it says that all 5 women were strong supporters of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was first proposed by the Woman's Party the prior year. My web searches also turned up a 1925 Chicago Daily News Almanac that had been scanned into Google Books. It lists the outcomes in all the 1924 races around the country, so we can see the vote totals in Jenny's race as they were published around that time. So let's show the next slide, which shows those voting results highlighted at the bottom there. You can see Jenny placed a distant 3rd in losing to the incumbent male Republican. Philadelphia was very Republican then, but she still won just over 3,300 votes, so not too shabby. Now, I mentioned earlier that while Liz and I were gathering information, Liz had begun closely reading Jenny's memoir, which wasn't an easy task. Liz describes it as very stream of consciousness. It shifts around to different time periods. Liz did locate Jenny's comments in the memoir about her suffrage activism, and my bulletin article quotes from it. Now, I don't have a copy of, I don't have an image of the memoir, but I believe that Liz is attending this session and can show it at the end of my remarks, so stay tuned on that. Meanwhile, let's show the next image, which is a page from Jenny's autobiographical statement in her campaign literature. So here, I know it's not really legible, but Jenny talks about her political awakening and early labor activism. And she says that she worked for suffrage, work, by the way, that included writing a column called Woman's Part in a weekly paper, the Philadelphia Socialist, because she, quote, felt very keenly that the special handicap under which women suffered should be removed without delay, end quote. Later in life, Jenny and Isaac built a home near Media, and the news briefs that I turned up included ones from Delaware County newspapers between the late 1940s and early 60s. These reported on Jenny hosting speakers and other events at her home in support of such causes as the League of Women Voters, the United World Federalists, and the American Friends Service Committee. And let's show the last image, which is a family photo from Jenny's later years. This is also courtesy of Liz. Jenny is on the left, and this was taken on Father's Day, 1971. So she was then in her early 80s and still had 2 decades ahead of her. Finally, Liz's outreach to her cousins also proved critical to piecing together Jenny's story. Liz passed along vivid recollections from a grandson and a nephew of Jenny's. These especially helped flesh out details about Jenny's strong personality and positive influence on the younger generations, and they made clear that she remained opinionated and politically aware right up until nearly the end of her life. So I'm delighted to have played a part in bringing Jenny's story to light at RS. I wish I had known her. I invite you to check out the bulletin article for more of her story, and I especially want to thank Liz Shapiro for alerting us to Jenny and thus sharing her with all of us. And Liz, if you're here, maybe we can unmute you and you can show us what you've got. Thank you.
So I'm here and I'm under Elizabeth, and it is Shapiro. There are generations
Shapiro.
rolling in their graves.
I'm sorry.
Please,
All
please.
these.
They did come from New York. So I have a copy of the memoirs, but even more than anything I could impart on you, I know my cousin Patsy, who remembers Robin Hill, is on here somewhere, and Jenny's grandson, Frank, I believe, is on here.
Yes, I see.
So, I mean, I can show you these memoirs. It's 62 pages typed, and it's really pretty incredible, and it does ramble, and but no disrespect, Frank.
No.
But they could answer questions probably better than I could.
Oh, could we get a little bit more of a look at that?
Sure.
And I've been hearing about the memoir for a long time now, so it's all loose
Can
paper.
you see?
So it's all just loose type paper.
Oh, it's loose pages, yes. My mother was going through it probably about 20 years ago, sometime after my father passed, and was trying to put it in chronological order. I think she thought there might be some value. And here is actually the paragraph, I don't know if you can really see it, where she talks about being a zealot, and that speaking on street corners, that she was sure that she knew how to save the world, and anything less than complete devotion to the cause would be sinful. She actually goes on to say, and I think this is pretty fascinating, that when a cousin offered me singing lessons, I consulted one of the elder comrades to ask whether it be right to take time from the movement, the time to practice. So they gave the approval, but she was a teenager.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And I think I'll turn things over to Julie.
Julie.
Yeah, there she is. You're muted?
I am unmuted. Paul and I will answer the questions you've left in chat. And if anybody has questions to ask now, you can click your raise hand button. Candace will unmute you to speak. And also at the very end of the session, we might have some additional time to talk informally.
Thanks, baby.
You can imagine we have a lot more to say.
And I just want to say,
any questions? Candace, did you find any questions?
I have a question.
I don't see any in the chat. Oh, someone has.
Gail, question? I have a question. So this sounds like really complete research, deep research that both of you have done. So over what period of time did you do it? How did it unfold? You talked about the steps you took. So how much time did you devote to sort of getting to the knowledge that you have?
I don't, let's see. Well, so I started looking into this sometime in the fall, and I've spent a lot of time on it, but certainly, you know, it's not like it's something I'm doing full time. And it's also something I really enjoy doing, so it's not exactly a hardship. What has been hard is that we were in the middle of going through some really interesting newspapers when the lockdown happened. And that really has made me feel like this is still a bit incomplete. And I'm very much looking forward to being able to go back to the Exponent, back to the Historical Society, and look at some more documents. So I think this is, you know, I think I've got a sense of this one woman, but there's a lot more to find. I don't know what Paula wants to say about that.
Oh, well, as I mentioned, we learned of Jenny when we put the notice in the January bulletin, and Liz responded. And I had a first conversation shortly thereafter, but of course, Liz was doing a lot of the heavy lifting, reading the memoir and reaching out to the cousins, which was the most critical part. But of course, as soon as I had the name, I just started Googling and just Googling in every variant of her name that I could imagine, because somehow each time I did that, new things turned up. So so we had conversations, and then each kind of working on this for I don't know, probably a couple of months, I suppose.
Right.
And then and I see Liz raising her hand there.
Something did come up today with one of the cousins because Jenny's child, Jenny's son changed his name to Dorn with an E at the end and became a partner in a business with another cousin, Dorn and Margolin. So whether she would have been listed under that or not, I don't know.
Oh. Yeah. But there was, and it was kind of amazing amount of stuff to put in a name of somebody whose life mostly took place quite a while ago, and still find all these records turning up, even without the access to more extensive records and specialized sites.
Right.
So I can only imagine what other materials, if we took another look through a lot of sites that are not easily accessible, would turn up even more.
Right. I see a question. Somebody asked whether or not there's any evidence that these two women knew each other. And I don't have any evidence, but I'm sure they did.
Well, as I noted that item where a talk by Bertha was happening on the same day as a talk by Jenny. I mean, I would like to think that a lot of the women who circulated in the city going to similar events were probably aware of each other at least, but I'm not sure we'll ever have a way to verify that.
And then I see another question that says, what do you think are the lessons for today?
Do you want to try that one?
Well, I have a couple of things to say, of course. I think one of the lessons is that there are lots of people who worked to get big things done, and they're mostly forgotten. And it's valuable, I think, to remember that people who had a part in making big change should be remembered in some way, even if it's just to say their names sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also think that women often get lost from history, and they get lost, and Paula, you'll probably understand what I'm saying. When they get married and their names change, suddenly it's very hard to trace them, or it's much harder to trace them. And some of the people on the committee will notice that it's even hard to find very much out about the women at the synagogue because their names are always listed as Mrs. Harry something. They don't have their own names even for us to study them. So those are some of the lessons for today. We have to look hard for people who were important in their own way, even if it's a small way.
Yeah. I see there's a two-part comment from Marsha Weinrab, who is the head of the RS Suffrage Project Committee. Well, first she notes that Broad and Wallace, where I identified Jenny as having given a talk, was a big shirt factory, which I was not aware of. It also mentions that Ellen Poster and Carol Perloff, both of whom are on this call, and are also highly involved in the suffrage project, have been studying other suffrage workers. If either one of you wants to say a few words.
Well, this isn't about Carolyn Katzenstein, who's the person that I was involved in studying, but rather to say that what you and Julie have done, besides elevating these really strong, wonderful women and bringing them to our attention, is to show that they come from all different socioeconomic classes, from working women to upper middle class women, So we've gone from at the beginning of our project thinking that there were maybe no Jewish Philadelphian suffragists, except perhaps Carolyn Katzenstein, to now seeing that there were many of them, as Julie says, there's a million at least, and that they come from all walks of life. And I just think that's so fascinating. Thank you guys for this incredible presentation that you've put together.
Welcome.
Well, this was also really fun to research. I just find this subject fascinating, and to learn about people who you never heard of and find the lives that they lead, I think is very inspiring.
Can I make a couple comments? First of all, I taught in Jenkintown High School in 1971 for a couple of years, and I was really appalled that when they had the faculty handbook, only the single women had first names. The married women were all, just like you said, you know, Mrs. Harry Schwartz. And that was 1971 to 1973. We're not talking about, you know, ancient history. I was really shocked to see that when I taught there. But I was so fascinated while you were talking. I couldn't help but start Googling, because I just do that. And I found this amazing picture. And clearly Bertha was way ahead of her time, because it looks like she's smoking a cigar. She was really advanced there. Can you see that?
Yeah, I see it.
Anything else? I know that Liz mentioned, I think there's a couple of other relatives of Jenny on the call. I don't know if any of you wanted to share a memory of her or anything like that.
If I could, I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not so good at Zoom. My name is Frank Aguilera. I'm Jenny's oldest grandson. I lived with her as a small child until she and Isaac.
Oh, you
So I
sound
really thought of her more as my mother. Annoyed my mother for years that I really was so devoted to Isaac and Jenny. I think the thing that Jenny taught right up until her 100 and something birthday, she was a person I spoke to 2 or 3 times a week. I'm an anthropologist. In the 60s. We were working in the backwoods of Spain. At 79, Jenny came, walked up and down hills. She drove us into the ground. We didn't sleep as much as we did. She decided that the chairs in the dining room were a different size as chairs at home. She measured all the chairs. One morning I found her measuring chairs so that when she got home, she could compare the Spanish measurements to the Philadelphia measurements. She never stopped having the most positive outlook on everything in life. She was funny and sweet. She loved to frighten small children. And her motto, which she has instilled down to 3 or 4 generations of her family, is strong, smart, brave, and kind. You have to work at those 4 things. But remember, you'll never be the strongest. Someone will always be stronger. Someone will always be kinder. Someone will, but it's the Zen sort of thing. It's the road you take and the attitude you take into life. The reason I miss her still is that when things were terrible, I could call Jenny up and she would explain to me where the silver lining was. Her ability to see the silver lining allowed her to keep working against extraordinary odds. She was really monumental. And I'm so pleased that so many of you, that you wrote the article and that so many of you have seen my Jenny. Thank you very, very much.
Oh gosh, well, thank you so much. And it sounds like we could use some of her spirit right now.
Yeah, that's right. I'd like somebody to tell me the silver lining of what's going on right now.
Right.
Yeah. So if that's the last question, I think it is. We can stay here and talk for a little bit longer. And Candace, I had one more picture, if you could put it up. Let's see if we got it. Did you hear me, Candace?
I'm not sure I had this picture.
It's the last one in my PowerPoint. If you can't find it, don't worry.
Sorry,
Don't worry.
not sure where it went.
What I have, and I will find a way to share it with everybody, is a photograph from the newspaper from 1915 of Suffrage Day at the Phillies game. And it shows one of the suffragists throwing out the first ball. And I think we're all in the mood for, well, maybe not all of us are in the mood for some baseball, but we're all in the mood for something happy. There it is. Thank you. And anybody who wants to stay now and chat a little bit longer, Paula and I are happy to talk about these people forever.
I'd like to say something if I could. I couldn't get my video going today, but this is a picture of our garden that we're working on right now. But I want to congratulate Julia and Paula for this wonderful work. We on the Suffrage Project have been so thrilled to be able to listen as they recounted their activities along the way from October till now. We, as several of us on the project can say, we've had great meetings listening to everybody's activities. We have a lot more to do because we're reconstituting ourselves not just to do this archival and inspiring work, but also to start reminding people that it took so much for us to get the vote in the first place that it's critical that we exercise that opportunity to vote this June and again in November. And so a bunch of us are working on various projects to both bring more of this information to our listeners and also to help others know about the mail-in votes, how to get them, and how to submit them. Jonathan Groder has been working on that. Adele Rubin has been working on that. Linda Karp has been working on that. I'm afraid I'll forget some other names. Fran Levy has been working on that. And Carol Perloff has been working on that. And perhaps if you're interested, please email me. My email is in the Road of Shalom directory and marsha.weinrub@temple.edu. I'll connect you. We have meetings about once a month where we hear about people's activities, and we're working in new ways to see what we can do to make these women's and men's lives, people who work so hard to get us to vote, come to life so that we can be inspired by them and use that to inspire others. So I'm so proud of the work we've done. Paula and Julia, you're wonderful representatives of all of this. And it's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Okay, and I just have two more things to say before we have informal chat. The first is that there is an evaluation form available for your feedback, and Candace is going to post the address in chat. And the second thing is that this was just the first day of the new days of learning, and there's programming available all week, and the schedule is on the website. There's a lot of exciting classes coming up. So I hope everyone will go to the website and sign up for some more classes. And now we're going to adjourn for informal chat.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
I'd like to say that I just wrote it in the chat, that I see that you said suffragists and not suffragettes.
Yes, I did.
I'm so pleased. Thank you.
Well, and they would be pleased too, because suffragette is a term that's used in England, And when it's used in the United States, it's slightly derogatory, slightly, but they didn't like it. They like suffragist.
I think, especially to our modern ears, anything with an E-T-T-E-N sounds old-fashioned. One interesting thing I learned, not in doing this research, but some other research, is that, you know, there were some men's groups that were formed in favor of suffrage, and they were apparently referred to, I don't know, maybe jokingly, as suffragents.
Right.
So that was, I learned a lot of things. That's one of them in doing this research.
Right.
I just want to thank you guys, because I think it was amazing. Your presentation was wonderful, but you really sent me on a journey that I never expected. And I've never met Frank, or if we did, we were very young.
Oh.
So on and on and on. And there's now this email chain of 30 relatives. Pretty incredible. But your presentation to both of you was wonderful.
Oh, well,
inspiring.
I mean, couldn't have done it without you. I always felt like I was kind of nosing into your family, but it was so fascinating.
Yeah, no, and if you ever want to see it, I told one cousin I'd copy it for you. I mean, it's not, no, copy it for him. I'm sorry. So I'd be happy to share it. All right. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Liz.
I've been thinking that one of the reasons I got so attracted to the topic was these women remind me of my own grandmother. And when I see the pictures, they look like the pictures I have of my grandmother from this era. I don't know if she was involved in the suffrage movement, but I do know that she thought voting was practically a holy act. So she was aware, I think, of how valuable it was.
Yeah, I had never thought about that in relation to my grandmothers, but it makes me wonder now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anybody have anything to add? Maybe we'll sign off then. Okay. Thank you guys for coming.
Yes, thank you so much. And
thank you,
tuned.
Candace.
Yes.
Thank you, Candace, for doing the photos for us.
Yes, thank you.
Look forward to seeing you at other classes later in the week.
And thanks to Gail and Ellen for arranging for this session to begin with.
Exactly.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.